Aloha. I'm Paul Norman. I'm the Executive Director of Neighborhood Place of Puna. And today I just want to recognize that May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And, why do we need a Mental Health Awareness Month, right? And because really there's still a tremendous amount of stigma and stereotyping around mental illness and mental health. And I came across a quote recently. I think that really says a lot about where we are and where we want to get. And that quote is going to a counselor or a therapist when you're feeling sad and overwhelmed should be as normal as going to the doctor when you have the flu. Right? So, uh, going to a counselor or a therapist should be just as normal as when you have the flu or you have um, a physical malady and you need to get treatment or you need to see a doctor, you need to see a professional to help you figure out how to treat it. And like with, physical illness, we need to recognize that there are lots of different types of um, illness, lots of different types of mental illness, right? So you can be, um, there can be situation, mental illness or not even mental illness, but there can just be situations where you just need to talk to someone, you need help. And then there can be very hard to diagnose and very hard to deal with illness, just like there are with physical illnesses. Doctors aren't magic. They don't fix everything magic. Some things they don't know how to fix. Some things takes a long time. Some of the things you just have to deal with. Um, and you know, I mean, I think as a community, as individuals in the community, the biggest thing that we can do is just be aware of our own biases and our own prejudice um, around mental illness, around our thoughts about speaking to a counselor or therapist. What is the language we use? And I totally recognize that you know, it can be very difficult. It's very difficult to, be with someone who is ill, whether that's a physical illness or a mental illness or a combination thereof. Long term chronic illness is hard. And when you encounter people who have an illness, when you encounter them in the community, in the street, in your church, wherever, it can make us feel very uncomfortable. Right? We need to be honest about that we are uncomfortable. Many of us are made very uncomfortable when we see a person who is suffering, um, who is struggling in some way, and we don't know what to do. I mean, we can feel powerless. We don't know what to say. We just don't know how to respond. And we kind of need to own our own uncomfortableness around that instead of projecting that onto the other person who is suffering. Um, and this is hard. I mean, this is just really, really hard. I mean, Neighborhood Place of Puna runs an emergency shelter. We work with a lot of families who have all kinds of different um, things that they're struggling with. How you feed the kids? How do you make sure there are enough diapers? But also, there's trauma and there's mental illness, um, and how do you parse that and how do you deal with it? And the thing that I find most frustrating as a service provider is that for the individuals, for the communities that really need the most supports, they're often the hardest to find. It's hardest to find services for the people who need them the most. So, for example, at our shelter, we know that the majority of individuals experiencing homelessness have a history of trauma. And we also know that just being homeless itself is traumatic. and that in order to um, heal these traumas, in order to deal with these traumas, there's a tremendous amount of support that's needed, trained, professional level support. And yet, our experience again and again, which is not to say anything bad about the the agencies that are out there that are trying to do what little they can, but our experience over and over again is that it's really hard to get help, and especially ongoing help. Um, so as a community, we need to recognize that the families and the individuals who need the most help often have the hardest time accessing that help. And so, not to be, not to make this a completely depressing uh, vlog, but as a community, that's where the work needs to be done. So being self-aware, being aware of our own biases, our own prejudice, our own discomfort around individuals experiencing who are suffering with mental illness, or who are just suffering, who are just struggling. We need to recognize that. And we also need to recognize that more services are needed. And we need to value those services. And as I've spoken elsewhere about, we know that, at least in the case of trauma, we know that trauma has lifelong impacts, especially if it's untreated. And if we as a community are committed to ensuring that children have are raised in a safe, stable, and nurturing home, then that means that we also have to be committed to ensuring that children and families have the supports they need. And we're not just talking about mental health services, although this is Mental Health Awareness Month and that's our focus. But let's stop the trauma. Let's make sure every child has a home, right? Homelessness itself is traumatic. Let's make sure every child has sufficient food to eat. Let's make sure that parents and families have access to mental and physical health services, sufficient mental and physical health services, that they can afford the medications they need. I mean, that's all part of the package of um, supporting our families and raising children in a safe and nurturing home. So once again, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Um, I hope that you'll take a little bit of time to reflect within yourself about your own um, biases, your own experiences um, with mental illness, or your own experience with counseling, if you've had the good fortune to access that when you needed it. Um, but also to think about maybe ways that you have discouraged others from getting the help they need. Because, as I say all the time, I believe that we as a community, if we make the commitment, if we open our hearts to the needs of families and children, we can create communities in which all children are raised in a safe, nurturing, and stable home. Aloha, and have a wonderful day.